let's see. Just so everybody knows, this meeting will be recorded. Looks like Maddox's ready to go, so I'll get us started here. So first of all, thank you so much for being here. It's our honor and pleasure to welcome you to tonight's webinar. For those of you who may be new, my name is Adam Barrington, and I'm the national organizer for Public Rail Now, the Railroad Workers United Public Rail Ownership Campaign. And in just a moment, we'll hear from Maddox Thomas. He's the author of our recently published white paper, Putting America Back on Track, the case for a 21st century public rail system. And we're also going to hear from Ron Cameco. He's one of the founders of RWU, and he'll give us the workers' perspective, and he'll discuss the everyday struggles and hardships that railroad workers experience under the current privately owned rails regime, and also talk about how public rail ownership will considerably benefit railroad workers. So just kind of give a rundown of how this will go. So before we conclude tonight's webinar, we'll answer some of the questions that were submitted by attendees, and we're going to make sure we prioritize the questions that came in as people were registering for the webinar. So if you have any questions, please submit them into the chat. And if we have time at the end, we'll get to them and answer them to the best of our ability. So that is about it. So without
join the meeting.
I'll pass it off to Maddox.
Hi. I'm going to just give it a few more minutes before I really get into my presentation, just because we seem to still have people popping in, and it keeps dinging every few minutes. So I can put headphones on so that it will stop notifying everyone when somebody joins the meeting on my end. And then hopefully by like 8:05, we can get going and everyone will be in. So hold a few more minutes. Okay, that should take care of the somebody joined the meeting notification from echoing back at y'all.
Maddox,
Right.
I might actually let people know that if you see that your name is Sigrid Peterson, I am the real Sigrid Peterson. But I think that the one of the reminders I sent out today apparently had like a URL trailer that made you me, but you are you. And so if you have a question later, I'll make sure that I ask people to announce you. But if you see your name as Sigrid Peterson and you're confused, you're still you. And we'll figure it out in a bit.
All right, it's almost 8:05, so I think we can go ahead and get started with the presentation. Pull up my screen. Can't present it from when you have the whole tab, so you can't pull it down. There we go. Excellent. All right, so this presentation is going to be essentially a rundown of some of the highlights and the key findings from the white paper that I published. This has been a project of over a year of research, and it has finally gotten wrapped up. Not everything that went into that research project made the final paper. There's a lot more that can be said about public rail and a lot more that needs to be talked about and discussed. But this is sort of some of those key findings that makes the case for why we need a public rail system, a vision of what that might look like. So start off with an overview of the U.S. rail system. We have 6 Class 1s. Up until last year, we had 7, but then Canadian Pacific and Kansas City Southern merged, and now we have 6. So since the 1980s, with the passage of the Staggers Act, which deregulated the rail industry, we've seen this enormous consolidation from well over 100 Class 1 railroads down to fewer than 10. And that's left us with essentially 2 duopolistic systems in the United States. On the East Coast, we have Norfolk Southern, CSX, and on the West Coast or west of the Mississippi, we have Union Pacific and BNSF. There are also 2 Canadian-owned Class 1 railroads, Canadian Pacific and CPKC, which essentially run down the middle of the country, and all of these railroads meet in Chicago. For a sense of scale, this is the revenue for all of the Class 1 railroads in the United States. It's a little bit deceiving to see CPKC and CN, Canadian National, being so large relatively. They are large railroads, but most of their operations are in Canada. And so comparatively in the United States, they're a lot smaller. And so we've got the much larger Western railroads, the somewhat smaller, but still very large Class 1s in the East, and then the Canadian railroads. So probably the number one issue on folks' minds over the past couple of years has been safety with the railroads. We've seen a marked increase in the accident rate. Of course, East Palestine was dramatic and a tragic accident that was far from an accident. It has clear ramifications to the way that the railroads have been operating over the past 10 to 20 years, that these kind of incidents continue happening and will continue to happen as long as we have the operating regime that prizes short-term profits over investments in safety. We've seen massive layoffs in just about every section of the rail workforce. And what that's meant is that the workers who are left have to deal with the speed up and working faster and getting pressured to not report defects. And as a result, there aren't enough people to fix the cars. The railroad companies themselves are going as far as telling car inspectors not to do any inspection and just sign off the car and send it on. As a result of that, you see things like Union Pacific had a surprise inspection from the FRA, and it was found that 72.7% of their locomotives have FRA defects. That's not a very good figure that you want to hear if you live near a rail line. I mean, a 28% accident rate, a 28% rise in the accident rate over the past 10 years is a massive reversal over decades of general improvements in safety. And then since even before precision scheduled railroading really took hold of the U.S. railroads in 2017 and 2019, we started seeing a reversal of that. And it began to climb again. It's a lot worse in the Class 1s than it is on some of the smaller railroads. We have Norfolk Southern, which achieved a whopping 128% increase in the accident rate. That's more than double the number of accidents than they had in 2013 and 2022. And this is closely tied to the next point, which is the mistreatment of workers. We've seen since peak employment in the last century or since 2000 in the rail industry of about 210,000 rail workers, that the entire industry is down to 150,000 rail workers. And this paints a slightly better picture because this includes some smaller railroads and Amtrak and commuter railroads, which are actually doing a bit more hiring now. But huge layoffs. And we've now got a situation of a lot of understaffing, but also the treatment of workers. Most folks now don't have any reliability in their work schedule. And so you're dealing with fatigue across the board. And an FRA report on fatigue found that the overwhelming majority of conductors or engineers report being fatigued. You got 40% of engineers with chronic fatigue, and then you've got, according to that information, it's coming from this irregularity in schedules and from having no idea before 2 hours ahead when you get a call when you're going to be on a locomotive. You get a call at 3 a.m. And you have to be on a locomotive, and then you have the same situation happening in the shop crafts of fatigue, but also dealing with just understaffing, forced overtime. And then the consequence of this is you have a lot of harm to safety. And you see people getting injured and dying on the railroad, who should not be getting injured or dying on the railroad because there aren't enough folks to do jobs properly, and they're being forced under pressure by management to work faster and faster with less people and less time to do their jobs. You got a situation where, for the sake of achieving this sort of short-term increase in profits, we have people paying in their lives and in blood. And at the same time, shippers are hurting too. So we're moving 30% fewer carloads of freight in 2023 than we were in 2000. It's dipped further in 2024. We haven't seen a recovery after any of the economic recessions this century. And a large part of that is because once the railroad lays off a ton of folks during a recession, it's harder and harder to bring people back, especially as the quality of the jobs declines. It's not as enticing to come back and take that job. And people who have been laid off or furloughed will get a job elsewhere, and the railroads aren't providing the kind of quality of life that incentivizes people to come back. And as a result, we have understaffing. They can't meet their needs to serve customers because they just don't have the crews. They don't have the desire to hire the crews, and they don't have the respect for their customers. And so we have a lot of contracts with customers across the country that are being unfulfilled. Agreements that are signed that say 7 days a week, switching service will happen at this location. And it's maybe the railroad is bringing a train 2 or 3 days a week. They're not telling their customers when that train's going to come. It just shows up. And then that manufacturer, that farm, has to have the issue of finding enough people to unload or load that train on a moment's notice. And this leads to a lot of expensive overtime for small businesses that may not even have space in their own siding to fit the 6 or 7 cars that should have been delivered over the course of 3 days, become 1 day a week now because the class ones have sporadically decided that it saves them money to do it that way, and they don't care what impact that has on American businesses. As a result, you see that quote there, that is the worst that it has ever been. That's coming from the Sandstone and Gravel Association. They have been, of course, shipping sandstone and gravel by rail for well over a century in the United States. These are customers that don't really have the choice of shipping by truck in a lot of cases because of the volume and the weight of aggregate. And railroads have taken them for granted. They don't have another competitive option, and the service to them is just low on the totem pole as far as the railroads are concerned, and they've been left behind. Hence, we see everyone that can shift to trucks is shifting to trucks, and even aside from that, there's been little to no effort on the part of railroads to actually achieve any sort of mode shift or capture new traffic. Intermodal has been one somewhat bright spot in terms of volume. We've actually seen a 40% growth in intermodal volume over the last 30 years or so. But it's going increasingly from the West Coast to the East Coast, from the East Coast to the West Coast, and maybe sometimes to Chicago. The railroads are treating this country like 2 big import-export terminals with no desire to serve anyone in the middle. And you can see that here. This specifically is looking at lanes going from the West Coast to the East Coast, Union Pacific's territory to CSX's. But the same principle holds for just about any given route. We see in here, this was at the peak of precision schedule railroading, a regime of rampant cost cutting at pretty much any expense to reduce the operating ratio, which is the ratio of expenses to revenues for a railroad. And so they have decided to close wholesale dozens of terminals across the country. And what's left is you have maybe a 200 or 300 mile longer journey by truck to pick up goods from a terminal. At that point, you might as well ship it by truck. And so this is leaving a lot of growth on the table that could be offered if end-to-end rail service still existed. but the railroads aren't interested in that kind of growth. Even profitable growth is being left on the table for the sake of keeping a high profit margin, the low operating ratio. Even profitable growth that could have been an option were there quality service and were there intermodal terminals has been cast aside. I decided it's worth talking about here, the Norfolk Southern proxy fight. I give it a short mention, the white paper. It deserves a little bit more discussion. Recently, after the derailment in East Palestine, Ohio, there was a lot of public pressure on Norfolk Southern. As a result of that, their CEO and some of their management made at least an attempt to act slightly better in the public eye because of that pressure. Claiming to do something called resilience railroading, where they don't furlough people every time that the economy takes a slight downturn so they can bounce back, and saying that they're going to focus more on safety. Well, a hedge fund named Ancora decided to challenge them for control of the corporation via a proxy fight, saying that they're going to go back to hardcore precision schedule railroading. And Norfolk Southern's management said, okay, well, we're going to cut 15% of our intermodal services. And they just did that in one day. They got rid of them. And they recommitted themselves to the cult of the operating ratio. 30% of CEO pay has been changed to be directly tied to a low operating ratio. And they've committed themselves to a sub 60% operating ratio by 2026, which is a truly scary feat. Below 60% is almost unheard of, and it's a really, really bare bones operation if you were to achieve it. That's sacrificing a lot of safety for both workers and trackside communities. One of the anecdotes I like to share about this is that Hunter E. Harrison, who is sort of the progenitor of precision scheduled railroading, used to fly around in a private jet that had a tail number OR59 because he dreamt of achieving that. And barely did. But it has not ever been achieved sustainably, and it never will. And if Norfolk Southern is setting out to achieve this, it's at extraordinary cost. And this is that the good guys, the incumbent management under Alan Shaw, won. So it's just an illustration that this is not an industry that can be easily just reformed through better management or light regulation. There is a need for public ownership and accountability. Infrastructure investment, another area where the Class 1s have wholeheartedly dropped the ball. There was a study commissioned at the bequest of Congress in 2007. It was commissioned by the Association of American Railroads, which is the trade group / lobbyist entity for the rail industry. And it determined that in order to just maintain capacity, and this is assuming no increase in passenger service, no modal shift, no greater share of freight traveling by rail. What do we need to maintain service in terms of investments in track? And they determined that was $148 billion in 2007 money by 2035. Not an enormous sum, but a sizable amount of money. The Class 1s need to spend about $135 billion, and they are not on track to achieve that. They have done far less than that and instead spent $196 billion in buybacks and dividends. As you can see from the chart on the right, with Canadian National and Union Pacific, you have this blue segment in the top right, which is the entirety of their capacity expansion, track maintenance, and equipment budgets for an entire year in 2022. And the green section, which is almost 3 times as large, is what they spend on buybacks and dividends. So it's not that they don't have the money, it's that they're choosing not to spend it. They're spending less than $1 billion a year in capacity expansion. And Union Pacific being the second largest Class 1, spending only $584 million is far below what needs to be spent as an industry. And so what does that mean? It means that we're looking at a railroad system that currently looks like this, with somewhat sufficient capacity most everywhere, as of 2005, and this is from the study, to a railroad system that looks like this, where pretty much every major main line is above capacity, or near and at capacity. And the only way that there is to forbid this from happening at the moment, insofar as an effort is being made, seems to be that the class ones are actively avoiding growing traffic and actually driving customers away. So that's not a great solution. It would be much better to make this investment. But it's clear that the private class ones aren't interested in making that investment for our critical infrastructure. Related to that is the question of electrification. It comes up a lot in the context of decarbonization and climate change, but it's also just a much better technology from an operational perspective. You can get much lower operating costs under electrification. It's fuel agnostic, such that as the grid becomes more sustainable, the railroads can become more sustainable if you just put up the wires. And with this energy efficiency and operating costs, you have cost savings for customers because you can operate the system more efficiently and more affordably. And so the railroads have done everything but consider actual catenary electrification because it costs money up front. There's a significant capital investment that needs to be made, but clearly they have the money. They could be making investments in our rail system, but they're choosing instead to lavish money on buybacks and dividends. They're claiming, however, that it's a technical problem, that the technology doesn't exist. They've said this in testimony before Congress. Everything that they have said in that vein is an outright lie and some sort of collective amnesia that we've seemingly forgotten that this country once led the world in railway electrification. Because that quote at the bottom left, that the problem is no longer a technical but a financial one, comes from 1918 and the Director General of the United States Railroad Administration, saying that we have the technology to electrify, we just need to finance it. And that's no less true today, except that we seem somehow to have forgotten that for the sake of avoiding any serious question about catenary electrification for technologies that are far from viable, like hydrogen and batteries. Related to this, there is a huge impact on community health from diesel pollution. The exhaust from diesel locomotives has a detrimental impact on not only trackside communities, but also on railroad workers' health. A lot of this is concentrated near rail yards, and for the workers who operate in and around locomotives, you see a 10 times higher risk of cancer and other lung diseases in those areas. And this, in the 21st century, is wholly avoidable. We have technologies to avoid this and clean the exhaust from locomotives. As you can see on the top right, locomotive tiers 2, 3, and 4, much cleaner than a not classified or NC locomotive or a 0 or a 1. Yet almost half of all line haul locomotives that the class 1s employ are tier 1 or tier 0 or below. And as far as yard locomotives, they've actively shifted to dirtier locomotives over the past, or over 3 years, which is the most recent reporting period from the EPA. Alongside this, we see trains blocking crossings in communities, leading children to crawl over or under them to get to school, and impeding first responders who sometimes have to go a mile or more out of the way to get around these long trains. And again, this is a problem that could be fixed if the class 1s cared or made a concerted effort to invest their capital in newer locomotives or in sidings that fit their long trains or operated shorter trains on faster schedules. But they simply haven't shown any desire to achieve it. And as a result, we have this current situation of disregard of trackside communities. Passenger service is also being held hostage by the class 1s. In 2023 alone, they caused the equivalent of 2,238 straight days of delay to Amtrak trains. That is well above the amount of delays caused by Amtrak or other reasons. And so it's also an example of the class 1s shoot themselves in the foot and then demand public subsidy. They are the ones that ripped up double trackage that used to exist in much of the country, and they have cut down on maintenance that's lowered the track speeds on so many of the main lines throughout the United States. This has caused derailments and it's impeded expanded service in the United States. Amtrak ends up having to pay, or the federal government has to subsidize hundreds of millions of dollars in new investments in rail corridors owned by the private class ones in order to just run one or two trains a day, which is effectively ripping up your own infrastructure and then asking someone else to pay to put it back. And this is all as part of a deal where Amtrak took over passenger service from the class ones back in the day because they were losing money on it. And so it's now a double subsidy for them. And it's holding up what could be a passenger rail renaissance for the United States. I mentioned Gulf Coast service because it's a particularly egregious example. CSX, to restore passenger service, one train a day, one long distance train a day between New Orleans and Orlando, demanded that Amtrak spend $2.3 billion in capital investments along that corridor just to add one train a day, one very short train compared to Class 1's 2 to 3 mile long freight trains. And $2.3 billion, to have a frame of reference, is more than twice of what CSX spent on capital investment in its entire year at the time when this was asked post-Katrina. And to this day, this service has not been restored because of the obstinance of CSX. And it's truly sad because this country deserves better passenger service. And perhaps the biggest obstacle remains the private ownership of the freight trackage and their unwillingness to cooperate with Amtrak. So I'm going to go a little bit into the history of public rail in the United States. The very first common carrier in the United States was the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, chartered by the state of Maryland, and it was owned by the state and the city of Baltimore well until the turn of the century, around 1900. This is because in the early days, a lot of the capital to fund railroads came from state and city governments because there just was not the private capital to do so, or private capital wasn't interested in risky endeavors like railroading. And so throughout the South, especially in Georgia, the Western Atlantic Railroad remains owned by the state of Georgia to this day. The North Carolina Railroad is owned by the state of North Carolina. Nearly every railroad in Virginia was 3/5 owned by the state of Virginia for a long time. And these railroads continued to see public investment and financing long after the 1830s and 40s. Even the standard railroad of the world, the Pennsylvania, was initially funded and continued to receive public subsidy throughout the 19th century in order to get it off the ground and provide what was viewed as a public service to the public rather than something that should be recaptured by solely private interests. And then around the Civil War, we see the first example of true nationalization in the United States, somewhat. The Railroad and Telegraph Act of 1862 authorized President Lincoln to seize telegraphs and rail lines that were necessary for the conduct of the war. This led to the United States Military Railroad, which took over a lot of rail lines near the front. Generally, those behind Confederate lines were seized and operated, but some near the war were as well. One of the more unfortunate parts of this was it was also used for strike breaking on several railroads up in the north. But that is part of why it does matter how public ownership is framed. Sometimes it can be used for different ends, and this is one of them. But it did end up being useful in terms of coordinating movement of material to the front. And then during the Civil War in 1862 and after, the federal land grants were given out. 179 million acres of land were given for free to railroads. That's more land than exists in the state of Texas. And these came with a lot of subsidized federal loans as well. And the interesting part about the federal land grants is it's a potential avenue for restoring public ownership in the United States, in that almost all of them retain some sort of reversionary interest to Congress, and that Congress still has the title to the land. The easement has just been granted to the Class 1s. And so many of these rights of way are still used to this day. And Congress might amend those land grant bills to transfer them to a public operator if the desire is there. and it's deemed that the class ones are no longer serving the public interest, as I think there's a fair case to say so. World War I is the largest era of public control in the United States. Between 1917 and 1920, the government took over operation of the railroads because there was chaos under private management. The private railroads attempted to voluntarily coordinate efforts to get material and troops to the front, generally meaning export on the East Coast through New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore. And they were unable to do it. They needed to pool their freight cars and cooperate as if they were one system, but they were unwilling to sacrifice traffic to rival roads, even if they were fully congested and couldn't actually handle it, because the idea of achieving profit first was so foremost in their mind. And so the government seized control of the railroads in the United States Railroad Administration. It provided with compensation to the owners of those railroads at their average operating income for the three prior years, and then achieved national coordination, true coordination through public operation, standardized rolling stock, declared neutrality in union elections, which is why during World War I is the period when most of the shop crafts got organized in the rail industry. And you see the effects of the standardization lasted long after. A lot of these locomotives and cars that were developed for the USRA lasted well long after. Immediately after the war, the Plum Plan was adopted and proposed by the railroad unions as a plan to maintain public ownership under tripartite control of management, workers, and the public, with a three-party board of directors controlling a nonprofit corporation that would operate the railroads, and it would lease the tracks, which would be owned by the federal government, and then operate them under a system of rate setting that no longer applies post-deregulation in the United States, but was very carefully devised so that the railroad would be able to earn a proper return that would be invested in capital improvements, and then any savings would go both to the workers who had earned them and to lowering freight rates for customers to incentivize better service and more shipment by rail. It was endorsed in all but name by the AFL-CIO, or both of its precursors at the time, the American Federation of Labor, later by the CEO in the 30s for public ownership separately. But it was stated that government ownership and democratic management was the way forward. And the Plum Plan League had hundreds of thousands of members that supported this end. Unfortunately, it did not fully come to pass, and Congress ended up handing the railroads back to their private operators. In the 1970s, we saw Conrail after the bankruptcy of Penn Central, which was the largest bankruptcy in U.S. history prior to Enron. The Northeast was very close to going entirely without rail service, which was a strong risk for businesses and passengers that were in the region. And so Congress, through the Regional Rail Reorganization Act of 1973, authorized Conrail, or the Consolidated Rail Corporation, which took over those lines as well as several others and restored them to profitability by 1981. There are some downsides to Conrail. It was mandated, as we'll talk about with Amtrak later, to be a profitable corporation. And as such, it made a lot of hard decisions about closing service on branch lines, and it ended up ripping out electrification among some segments of the line. But as soon as it became profitable again, Congress mandated that it be sold off, because we can't just have a good public utility in the United States. It has to go back into some private investor's pocket. And so it was put up to bid. The only viable bidder at the first auction was then the employees of the railroad. Reagan refused to sell to them, so it later got publicly listed and sold on the stock exchange, and then split up between Norfolk Southern and CSX. Present-day public rail. We still have a lot of public rail still today in the United States in various forms. Amtrak is probably the most well-known. Similar to Conrail, it was created in the 70s to take over unprofitable passenger service from private railroads who were struggling, and it has operated ever since. Amtrak has, of course, a lot of difficulties with funding and with its strange mandate in that it was created to take over unprofitable services to maintain passenger offerings, but it was mandated to become a for-profit corporation. How exactly it makes sense that this public entity that has taken over these unprofitable lines is going to magically become profitable wasn't really at the forefront of people's minds. It was largely done for political reasons, but Amtrak has nonetheless prevailed, and it continues to set ridership records across the system. There's a clear desire for a return of passenger service in the United States today. Related to that is the Northeast Corridor, which is largely owned by Amtrak and a few other commuter railroads along its length. Amtrak's made massive investments in improving the quality of the Northeast Corridor, and in the 90s, we saw the electrification of the last unelectrified section of the Northeast Corridor between New Haven and Boston. And it had nearly 1 million daily trips on it pre-pandemic, and we're getting back to that level now. It's also on some of its services seeing service already exceeding pre-pandemic highs, and there are several other corridors not quite to the same density or volume as the Northeast Corridor, but that are also owned by Amtrak, such as the Wolverine Corridor in Michigan, co-owned by Amtrak and MDOT, and the Keystone Corridor in Pennsylvania, the Empire Corridor, which goes part of the way up to Albany and New York. Commuter/regional rail, your other main publicly owned passenger rail service, fall into largely two categories of legacy systems, those being commuter rail systems that existed under private operation back a century or more ago and have existed continuously and today have been taken over by a public operator, generally around the same period of Amtrak and Conrail in the 60s and 70s. They were taken over to maintain service. And a lot of these, they own their own tracks. Many of them are electrified and because of the density of service, as opposed to new start systems, which are generally 2000s and more recent attempts to restart passenger rail service into and out of cities. And those operate generally on leased trackage or trackage rights achieved from private ownership. Some of these are subcontracted, such as in Boston, subcontracted to Keolis. A lot of them are directly operated by a public authority or are operated under contract by Amtrak. The other large category of public rail entities are state-owned rights-of-way. A lot of these, as I'm going to keep going back to, came from that era in the late 60s and 70s when the American rail industry was really struggling, and Class 1s were finally given permission to sort of abandon trackage en masse, especially post-1980 Staggers Act. And so a lot of rural communities in the United States would have absolutely no passenger service these days, or absolutely no freight service these days, if it weren't for state DOTs coming in and buying rail rights of way and then leasing them out to short lines, class 2 and 3 railroads to maintain that service and linkage to the overall freight network. There, in my home state of Georgia alone, 580 miles of track that are owned by GDOT, as well as the Western Atlantic Railroad, which exists in a sort of separate category that has maintained its public ownership to this day from the 19th century. Another example of that is the North Carolina Railroad Company, owned entirely by the state of North Carolina. During the 20th century, it was leased fully to the Southern Railway and then Norfolk Southern, which did a very bad job of maintaining it. And after it was returned to public infrastructure control and then a trackage agreement with Norfolk Southern in 1998, we saw increases in passenger speeds go from 49 to 79 miles an hour. Train lengths were able to be massively increased, and freight was even sped up from 10 miles per hour to 40 on certain sections because of investment in maintenance and actual track quality that was being done by the public authority. And so there's actually a fairly busy passenger corridor today. Public branch lines, port authorities, and terminal railroads are all slightly different, but I've sort of grouped them together. Generally somewhat small rail operations, freight focused, The Madison Railroad is an example of this that was purchased in 1978, and it was bought to avoid abandonment, and has since been able to cover its own costs, lead to new investment in that town. A lot of industry moving there because they have a rail connection, and that also in turn allowing them to invest in infrastructure improvements. Tacoma Rail is much older. It's been a public utility since 1914. It operates as a nonprofit public utility, which allows it to provide at cost or just above cost services, and maintain quality offering to its customers. For international comparisons, we have British Rail as an example of a failed privatization. Here you have the Hatfield rail crash that was largely the fault of the fragmentation of the industry, separating track from operations, very poor coordination between the two, and disincentives in doing maintenance for either of them that might affect the other. We've also seen that rather than privatization leading to lower subsidy, it actually has tripled since British Rail was privatized, and on-time performance is absolutely detrimental. On average nationwide, it's about 66%, and in certain regions, such as the north of England, it's 50% on-time performance. And this is on a system that is primarily passenger-oriented. And as a result of these failings, renationalization began actually under the Conservative government, and is now continuing under Labor. One chart that people like to point to is that starting in the 1990s, the line went up, therefore privatization must have been good. If you talk to a British person, they will think that that is ludicrous, because the quality of service has not only gone downhill, but ticket prices are now among the highest in Europe because they're price gouging their customers because they can and they're profit motivated. But you compare this to a fully integrated public system like Switzerland, and you see that Switzerland has fared better and also saw a better recovery from the pandemic. So that trend, though reflective of a larger return to passenger service and passenger rail, is not some miraculous improvement that was achieved by privatization, rather one that was achieved in spite of privatization. Indian Railways, it has achieved a lot of very impressive feats as a result of being a vertically integrated public railroad. They've been investing massively in dedicated freight corridors to allow double and triple stack container trains to operate under electrified wires, and these are double, triple, quad tracked corridors. And they've achieved the incredible feat of electrifying 25,000 miles of trackage in less than a decade. And this is a vision of what we could do in the United States if we had coordinated public ownership, but what the Class 1s have prevented us from achieving. And because a lot of the excuse for not doing electrification in the United States is often, oh, we're too big. Well, India is a fairly large country, and it moves the same amount of freight as the United States does. In 2023, it moved 1.67 billion tons, which is just slightly more than what the US did. Plus, they've recovered stronger and are actually growing post-pandemic, unlike the US. JR, Japan Railways, is a slightly complicated example of privatization. It's not a fully privatized system. It remains vertically integrated. They regionally separated their railroads. The public maintains control of several rail lines that are less profitable, and a lot of public investment still goes into Shinkansen lines, expanding them and maintaining them. And it still is regulated on the level of maximum rate setting, has to be capped at a reasonable level of profit that's set by the government. And a lot of these groups' profitability also comes from diversification outside of the rail sector, such as the ownership of both the track and the stations allows them to capitalize on that real estate, being between 30 and 60% of some JR Group companies' entire profits. Last, we have Switzerland, which has the highest per capita ridership and punctuality in Europe, which is achieved by its clock face pulse timetable. You know, on the hour, every 30 minutes, there's going to be a train at the station that you can get on. They're very coordinated between passenger and freight because they have this nationwide integration under public ownership. And they had a referendum nationwide that decided that we are going to make all of the transalpine traffic, or as much as possible, we're going to shift it to rail from trucks. They put their mind to it and they did it. Now, 74% of all transalpine traffic, that's traffic going through the Alps, through Switzerland, is on rail rather than on trucks, and that's preventing degradation on their mountains. It's lowering emissions in the country because their rail system's 100% electrified. And even within Switzerland, a significant portion of freight travels via rail. And an interesting note about Switzerland is not a member of the EU, but it rejected open access, which is something we'll get to next in the models section a little bit more. So models of public rail, there's a lot more nuance and complication and detail to each of these that can be discussed further, hybrid models that exist in between. But this is a basic overview of several of the paths towards public ownership. Open access is one that has become increasingly popular since the European Union decided to foreground it in its railway packages in the 1990s. It's similar to an idea that was rejected in the early days of rail, that the infrastructure would be the railroad and then people would pay to operate over it. The technology then was not such that we had any sort of reasonable signaling system. And so it was deemed non-viable and thrown away very quickly. It came back in the 90s as a result of some think tanks. It does not necessarily make as much sense in the US as it does Europe, which needs to bypass international borders to have international passenger service. The US is large enough as a country, and we have already a nationwide network. But with the separation of infrastructure and operations, there is a huge hit to coordination, which leads to a lot of added costs and also difficulty responding to changes in real time. As a part of this, this is part of the reason why Switzerland did not actually implement open access. They had the jurisdiction to do that because they're not formal EU members. They partially implemented some of the railway directives, but their concerns over it is that it would mess with their integrated timetable because they carefully plan rail service across the entire country. And if people are bidding in the open market to run trains when they feel like it, it's hard to coordinate on a national scale. And second, open access often leads to lower wages, or at least there's concerns that it leads to open wages and non-union operators. For example, Flixtrain here on the right, when Deutsche Bahn's operators went on strike, Flixtrain famously continued to operate, and of course, not part of that union. And so that is one of the concerns, is the sort of social dumping of lower quality crews with less training and experience entering the market backed by some financier who just wants to operate one profitable line. In theory, the open access is supposed to provide higher quality service at a lower cost. There's been limited empirical research that has backed this up. Certain corridors have been successful in Europe, but all of them have been related to passenger service. In the freight context in Europe, we've only ever seen niche freight operators that don't directly compete with each other. And most scholarship work focusing on the United States, which has heavy haul freight, concludes that it's likely less viable here. But it is one option in terms of public infrastructure operation with added competition on top of it. Franchising, similarly, public ownership of the trackage. It exists in a lot of commuter rail systems and state-owned rights of way. You've got public rails, private operator, and it can be either vertically integrated or separated, depending on how the lease and contract is structured, whether or not the franchisee is also responsible for maintenance, which lends itself to a question of who deals with the risk in that circumstance. And this is perhaps a more intermediate step, one that is currently used on a lot of class 2 and 3 railroads where the owner of the track is state governments. Likely not the most viable for a nationwide system where there's the returns to significant economy of scope of ownership top to bottom of operations and infrastructure, but could remain as part of state-owned rights-of-way post-public ownership of the main lines. But similarly, if it was done in the vertical separation model, like in Britain, we've seen the risks that loom fairly large there, which leaves the option of a fully integrated rail system. This would be that all of the publicly owned main lines are operated by one large railroad company that can run trains from coast to coast, achieving efficiencies of not having to swap engines or exchange between lines in Chicago, as currently happens with the class ones. But you can have also the easier infrastructure investment. One of the issues with vertical separation, with franchising, and with open access is that you have to coordinate between a bunch of different operators and the infrastructure manager in order to invest in electrification. And everyone might not agree on the improvements, and so you have a very slow, difficult time implementing them, as has been seen elsewhere, particularly in Europe. And you can also get smoother operations. It's a lot simpler to coordinate. You've got cost advantages. You can have true nationwide planning, which has not been done in the past with rail in the United States. And it would allow a path forward in a better passenger service as well as freight service on a nationally coordinated scale. So public rail offers, in summary, the ability to actually invest in critical infrastructure. We don't even need significant new federal investments. Under public ownership and operation of the rail system, we will redirect the funding that currently goes to buybacks and dividends to investing in infrastructure and in quality operations to lead the modal shift back to rail. Also ensuring full staffing and respect for rail workers, providing folks with regular schedules, creating tens of thousands of new jobs through construction of electrification, through double tracking, triple tracking of key corridors, and allowing for significant redundancy so that regular, reliable, and quality service can be provided to customers that they're not receiving now, which will achieve a lower cost of goods for the public and also have significant resilience that is necessary for passenger service to be expanded once again in this country.
All right. Thank you so much, Matic. We'll now move on to Ron Kamenko. So Ron will take a few minutes here to talk about the sort of railroad workers' perspective about what's going on, worker experiences under the privately owned rail system, and how public rail ownership would benefit rail workers. So Ron, take it away.
Thank you, Adam. And in the interest of time, I'm going to keep my presentation extremely brief. I think most of you probably saw that Matic touched on many of these issues that are central to railroad workers. And in fact, of course, all the issues, whether it benefits shippers or passengers or trackside communities or the nation's economy, all serve to benefit railroad workers. But there's a number of specific things that public ownership of the railroad could do to benefit railroad workers. I served as an engineer, conductor, brakeman. I started out actually working for Conrail. It had already been privatized in the 90s when I started my railroad term. We got taken over by a bigger Class 1, Norfolk Southern, in 99. And in 2004, I came to Amtrak, and I just retired this past November. Probably the biggest thing that it would seem to me that would benefit railroad workers is the effect on employment. As Matic laid out, there's the potential for huge expansion. The railroad industry has lost about 25% of its freight in the last generation. While railroads around the world are expanding, while trucking in this country is expanding, river traffic is expanding, other bulk commodity means of transport is expanding, the rail industry is in a state of decline, yet they're making record profits. And so it should be obvious that the opposite could be taking place, as Matic laid out. We could be shipping a lot more carloads by rail, and that would translate into tens of thousands of good railroad worker jobs. But instead, what we've seen under private ownership of the rail industry since the demise of public ownership for those brief years during World War I, we had about 2 million railroad workers in the country. 40 years or so ago, we had 500,000. And since precision scheduled railroading was instituted, numbers are as high as 35% of workers in various crafts have lost their jobs. And these jobs do not seem to be coming back, at least not under private ownership. And so the rail industry has made it very clear that they don't have any intention of changing course. They are pushing for single person crews, That would reduce the train and engine service workforce by up to 50%, because now instead of having 2 on every train, you just have 1. The industry has also made it clear that they would like to automate much of the maintenance of way craft. And they've also made it clear that they want to contract out the remaining jobs in the roundhouse, so to speak, in the various crafts that maintain cars and locomotives. And so it would seem to me, if you were a railroad worker, especially one with 5 or 10 years on the railroad, who would like to work in the industry for another 20, 25, maybe 30 years, it would behoove you to support public ownership of the railroad, partly because what do we really have to lose? For God's sake, the Class 1s have made it clear through their action, their word and deed, that they will eliminate jobs and make every effort to eliminate the remaining jobs, either through technology, contracting out, or spinning off to short lines and regional railroads that generally operate non-union at about half the wage rate. This is the agenda for the Class 1 rail industry. And so this is what is in store for us railroad workers, unless and until we advocate, like we once did, on behalf of something called the Plum Plan, which Matic also talked about, keeping the railroads, putting the railroads under public ownership. So let's take a look at that real quick. Every single railroad union in this country, at the time, there was, I believe, 15 rail unions. They all signed on to the Plum Plan. They created the Plum Plan League. There was a national referendum. The vote was 99% of rank and file railroaders voted in this plebiscite and agreed that the rail industry should be held publicly. 100 years later, unfortunately, we're not in that kind of situation. But it's important for railroad workers to understand that there was a time when our politics were quite different, and our understanding of public versus private ownership might have been quite different. We've been barraged by 100 years of propaganda about the so-called free market, which of course we know is nonsense, because we have 6 Class 1 railroads, but we used to have 100, and it's a monopolistic or duopolistic situation. And so therefore, we're buying into an antiquated, outmoded ideology that really makes no sense for our experience. And I think if you study the history of railroad worker support and railroad union support for the Plum Plan, you'll see that it made total sense that railroad workers of that time and our unions believed in public and worker control of the railroad industry. Matic also touched on safety. Every railroad worker working on the railroad is concerned about coming home in the evening in one piece, along with their co-workers. But yet, what have we seen based upon Matic's presentation? There's been an increase in derailments. The move to 2 and 3 mile long plus trains have been shown. A recent study, I believe, in National Geographic or Scientific American or what have you, there's evidence that longer trains derail more frequently, and when they do derail, they have a propensity to be a more catastrophic wreck. As I talked about, the carriers want to move to 1-person crews. They made no bones about the fact they want to go to 0-person crews. The lack of maintenance and inspection, which is endemic to the industry right now and has been basically labeled as the cause for the East Palestine wreck. All of this stuff is of concern to railroad workers. And to believe that precision scheduled railroading, Alan Shaw, Ancora, or whoever in Wall Street is running our rail industry is going to hold your safety first and foremost, I think that's really naive. I think we would do much better under a publicly operated system. And then for railroad workers who are still in doubt, railroad workers and their unions around the world are not clamoring for privatization. In fact, it's the exact opposite. Whether you're a railroad worker in England or France or Germany, Italy, Japan, or where have you, the cry of railroad workers and our unions is public ownership. We don't want privatization. We don't want to give away our national assets to a bunch of profit-making lazy stockholders who have never turned a wheel on the railroad. And so we need to start taking our cues more from our brothers and sisters overseas. Their experience has been very similar to ours. They may speak a different language and run on a different track gauge or what have you, have different locomotives and freight cars and passenger cars and so forth. But basically, they are up against a similar situation. And they've come to the vast, overwhelming realization that public ownership is a much better system that serves the interest of railroad workers and our unions. In the interest of time, I'm going to cut it short and leave it there. But basically, this is just a brief summary of why public rail ownership in this country is in the interest of every single railroad worker.
All right, thank you, Ron. We're not short on time, obviously, a little bit over actually, but just some closing remarks here. This is obviously a massive project. We can't expect to see major developments happening overnight, but the hope here is that everybody that is in attendance now can at least contribute something, some kind of skill, some kind of talent, using your influence wherever you can, so that we can together make public rail ownership a reality. So I'll keep it brief here, but as you can see, we got the slide up. Just some ways for folks to get involved. So, the name of the game here is building coalitions. And that means the process of building a mass movement that we need with public support. That means workers, organizers, everyday people throwing their weight behind this thing to bring about massive institutional change. So engaging with people across the spectrum of impacted groups here. Unions, rank and file workers, environmentalists, trackside communities, small shippers, farmers, anyone and everyone who's getting screwed by the class ones right now and would greatly benefit from a transition to public rail ownership. That's what we need to be engaging with. And that could be you. So here's just a few ways that we can all get involved. So if you're in a union or if you're in another type of organization, we've got a template available so that you can use that to write up a resolution in support of public rail ownership. Submit it and try to get it passed. Build that support within your union or your organization. Become an official endorser of the campaign. The more official endorsements we get, the more power we have backing us. So, and if you've already officially endorsed public rail ownership, make sure you visit our website, publicrailnow.org, and get that support listed. If you've got experience planning events, if you're used to hosting meetings, in person or virtually, reach out to me. We can get a meeting planned, or even without me, if you want to host like a little local gathering or what have you, talk about public rail ownership, that's great. Ron, Maddock, as well, like we're all very willing to help out and talk to folks whenever possible. And whether you're part of an organization or an individual supporter of public rail ownership, talking to coworkers, talking to family members, talking to your friends, folks in your community. Getting that public support for public rail ownership means starting that conversation, educating folks, directing them to information and resources. If there's community events going on, festivals, farmers markets, gatherings, what have you. Maybe you have experience distributing leaflets and stuff like that, talking about public rail ownership. I can send you stuff to print out. We've got a lot of materials that are ready to go for passing out at these public gatherings. And there's plenty of other ways to get involved, even from your own home. Social media is a great outlet for this kind of thing. So posting stuff about public rail ownership and directing people to our website, things like that on your social media pages. Writing letters to the editor. That's kind of an outdated form of communication, but hey, it's still an important aspect. Texting and phone banking, all these different things that you could do from your own home. Contact me. We can have a more in-depth conversation about how you can get involved. And like I said, everybody's got some kind of skill, talent, influence, ability, what have you, to contribute to this campaign. And we all need each other to make this thing happen. So with that, I know we're over time, but we did have a couple questions that came in like I said in the beginning, I think we want to prioritize the folks who would ask questions during the registration. In the interest of time, we might only get to a couple questions, but I think at this point, I'll let Sigrid take it away for our brief Q&A session.
Yeah, can everyone hear me okay? Adam, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. So the two questions that came in when people registered were number one, and this is for Maddock and probably all of us, but particularly Maddock, a big question, what is the path forward for public ownership, which you've partially addressed? That's a big one. And the second one was, how can local governments help advocate? What can local electeds do in this effort? So the first one, what is the path forward for public ownership? Big one, global one.
Yeah, so I think that this is a very complicated question, very multifaceted. I think the base level of that is building the campaign, building the public awareness, the buy-in from all the constituencies who currently are being done such a disservice by the private system of railroad ownership. And so it's about organizing that campaign and building up public rail now, hence why Adam is here as our organizer. We have all these ways for you to get involved, and we want you to get involved. And then from a sort of, if we are at the point of actually achieving some form of public ownership, different paths. I mean, we've seen states already buying up rights of way. A lot of it is buying up rights of way that the class ones want to dispose of anyway to rid themselves of maintenance obligations. And they don't want to deal with the passenger rail, so they'll sell it to a passenger rail authority. Still a great thing. It's awesome to see better passenger rail service happening because states are willing to buy out these rights of way. But it's also providing remuneration to these private entities that have abandoned and declined to carry out the basic maintenance of these lines and then handed it in very poor shape to the public. So, I mean, buying them out is an option on a state-by-state level. This is currently being done, can continue to be done on a small scale. Eventually, I think there needs to be some federal discussions about taking control of the rights of way, whether that be through some form of debt issuance and purchase, or through looking at the fact that a lot of these rights of way were funded by public money and arguably are still publicly owned, and revoking that easement from private management. And so that's part of the path towards public ownership, but there's also other aspects of this, like pushing for better safety regulations, pushing for electrification, pushing for more accountability from the railroads in the short term, as we build towards the end goal of a public owned operated system that truly acts in the public interest. We've got all these other facets that are part of building that campaign and building that public buy-in. I think I can let Adam talk a little bit about the second part of that question.
Adam, if I could just add to the path forward and say, the political question, we have to build a popular movement like was done 100 years ago around the Plum Plan. And so where does that start? The labor movement and the environmental movement, often at loggerheads, RW's been working for the last 10 years on this whole concept of the just transition and bringing labor and environment together around our industry, a key industry. And so if we expect to get environmentalists and their organizations like the Sierra Club and Greenpeace and other popular environmental groups on board, they're going to tend to take their cues from the labor movement. If the labor movement is not on board, it'll be harder to get the environmentalists on board. And it's going to be hard to get the labor movement on board if all 12 rail unions say they don't want public ownership. So RW has sort of dissected and analyzed this and come to the conclusion that we have to drag the rail unions kicking and screaming, whether they like it or not. We have to build a movement amongst rank and file railroaders by painstakingly having webinars like this and intervening in various ways possible to explain painstakingly to railroad workers, as we're trying to do, of course, today, that it is in their interest to nationalize the rail industry in the country. It is in their interest to have public control and ownership of the railroads in the United States. And then theoretically, that rank and file pressure can push the union leadership of the respective trade unions towards a position of just like 100 years ago, where all 15 unions endorsed the Plum Plan, then the rest of the labor movement would feel more comfortable and would come along. Then the rest of the environmental movement would also be taking their cues from organized labor. And we believe we could actually build a national movement, perhaps not just around public ownership of rail, but this could expand to potentially public ownership of the energy industry or the telecommunications industry. And I don't want to wax too poetic here about it, but we really have to start looking at the big picture of where the economy is going in the future and the fate of our democracy. And really, a mass movement around public ownership of rail could not only result in the public ownership of the rail industry is what we want, but it can also potentially spur a progressive movement in this country and other industries and amongst other trade unions for doing similar activities. And sorry to stray from the question, but it's all part of the big puzzle as to how we move the working class and society forward.
Yeah, the only thing is that and it's already really been said. We're talking about a mass movement here. There's no way that we're going to apply pressure on the power apparatus that we're dealing with here without a mass movement with mass public support. So again, this is something that we're going to have to build, and just to, again, emphasize the importance of coalitions. A coalition doesn't mean we all agree on 100% of what we're talking about. It means that we are coming together for a particular cause that we can agree on, what it looks like, how we get there. Maybe we have a little bit of debate.
Seems we may have lost Adam.
Yeah, it looks like
Sigrid, do you want to just fill in and keep us going in Adam's absence?
I probably can't speak topically to what he was talking about.
Of course.
Other than to heed his calls, and to say that we've put a lot in this chat in terms of how to get involved. We've recorded every single question that's been posed in this chat, and hope to either get back to you individually and or have it start forming filling out our FAQs in terms of how we respond to some of them. I am letting Adam know that he got booted. I don't know why he got booted. But since we're pretty much at time, unless anybody wants to chime in and disagree with me, I think what we might do is leave it there. We will email you these different ways to get involved, all the links, all the emails, all the ways to sign up. And we're just so very glad that so many people attended tonight. There'll be more to come with the campaign, and you'll be hearing more from us soon. And yes, we have recorded this. We have recorded this, and we our goal is to make it available to you. And Maddox, sorry, I interrupted you.
No, you're all right. I agree. I think that's probably a pretty good point to end on. The question I will speak very shortly on that was asked that Adam didn't quite get to, on how can local governments or people working in local government get involved in this campaign. Depends slightly on the situation, of course, but I mean, fill out the get involved form that's pasted in the chat and will be sent into the email, and get in touch with us. We can talk to you more about the particularities of your local community, but certainly there is the potential for cities and municipalities and county organizations to endorse public ownership on a local level, put pressure on state and federal electeds also in a sort of bottom-up fashion to get on board with public ownership, but also to think about the relationship of rail in your community. Certainly there are lots of communities that I've been around in Georgia and Rhode Island where I've visited that used to have frequent rail service, both freight and passenger, that no longer do. And there's the potential for a vision of public ownership to lead to the restoration of that service or a better quality service to a lot of towns across America. And so that's potentially one avenue is just thinking about rail and visualizing with the community of what that improvement might make. The extreme option is that if you're a municipality that has a rail line that has been abandoned, looking at the legal provenance of that land and try and figure out a way to either bring it under public ownership or see if it might already be a state-owned right-of-way. But do reach out to us and fill out that information form. We'd love to get in touch with everyone. Hope to see y'all in the future and would like to have you involved in the campaign.
Yeah, and I might say one more thing before people sign off. It's in this long list of ways to get involved, but in 1 week we have the committee that meets once a month to help move this campaign forward, and we'll send out in the links we send to you, how you might attend that meeting. But everyone's welcome to attend that, and if there are questions that you feel we couldn't get to that are naughty and lengthy, we can also address them at our monthly meetings like that and in other organizing capacities. And Adam, and I don't think he'd be mad at me for saying this, anyone is welcome to contact Adam as the organizer, who is having conversations as a good organizer does daily with individuals. That is a real thing. You can actually call and talk to an individual. And so I know he'd be happy to talk to any of you. Okay, and maybe we'll end there. Thanks, everybody. I'm gonna close out the meeting and I've saved the chat.
Thanks for coming, everybody.